For 10 years, the city of Troy had resisted. Its walls had stood against the greatest warriors of Greece. Generations had grown up knowing only war. Children became adults beneath the shadow of siege. Families learned to live with loss. Then, in a single night, everything ended. The Greeks entered the city. The gates were opened. The defenses collapsed. And Troy burned. History often remembers the Trojan War through its heroes. Achilles, Hector, Odysseus, Paris. Their names survived for thousands of years. But for the women of Troy, the war did not end when the city fell. In many ways, it had only begun. As flames spread through the streets, chaos consumed the city. Temples were violated. Homes were destroyed. Families were separated. The surviving women gathered wherever they could. Courtyards, sacred sites, ruined buildings, desperately waiting to learn their fate. They already understood one terrifying reality. The men who might have protected them were dead. Hector was dead. Priam was dead. Most of Troy's warriors were dead. The city had lost not only the war, it had lost its future. Among the survivors stood some of the most famous women in ancient legend. Hecuba, once queen of a great kingdom. Andromache, widow of Troy's greatest defender. Cassandra, cursed to know the future but never be believed. And, of course, Helen of Troy. Each had survived the destruction. None could escape what came next. As dawn arrived over the ruins of Troy, the Greek commanders began dividing the spoils of victory. Gold, weapons, treasures, and people. For the surviving women, this was the moment fear became reality. They were no longer citizens of Troy. They were prisoners. The city that had protected them for generations no longer existed. And now their futures would be decided by the men who had spent 10 years trying to destroy it. When the fires finally began to die, the women of Troy were brought together and counted, not as citizens, not as queens, not as noble women, as spoils of war. For 10 years, the Greeks had fought outside the walls of Troy. They had lost brothers, sons, fathers, and kings. Entire generations had been consumed by the conflict. Now victory belonged to them, and victory came with rewards. Among the ruins, Greek commanders gathered to determine how those rewards would be distributed. Gold could be counted. Weapons could be divided. Treasure could be carried home. But the surviving women of Troy represented something else entirely. Power, prestige, status. For the women waiting in uncertainty, every decision carried enormous consequences. Because their future would not be their own. It would belong to whoever claimed them. Among the most sought-after captives was Andromache. Only days earlier she had been the wife of Troy's greatest hero. Now she was a widow. Ancient traditions describe her being assigned to the household of one of the Greek victors. The woman who had once lived inside royal halls would spend the rest of her life under foreign control. The fall from queenly status to captivity was devastating. Yet Andromache was not alone. Across the city, countless Trojan women experienced similar fates. Some were taken by nobles, others by soldiers. Families were separated. Mothers lost daughters. Sisters lost sisters. Friends disappeared forever. And then there was Hecuba, once the most powerful woman in Troy, mother of princes, wife of a king, mistress of a thriving kingdom. Now she stood among prisoners watching everything she had built disappear. Ancient writers often portray Hecuba as the embodiment of Troy's suffering, not because she died, Because she survived. Survival forced her to witness every loss. Her husband, her sons, her city, her future. One by one, each was taken away. But perhaps no story captured the cruelty of victory more than that of the youngest survivors. Because among the prisoners stood children. Children whose only crime was being born in Troy. And for the Greek leaders, some of those children represented a danger. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. A surviving prince could grow into a future king. A future king could seek revenge. And revenge had already consumed one generation. The victors had no intention of allowing another. As decisions were made among the ruins, one terrible choice began taking shape. A choice that would become one of the darkest moments in the entire Trojan story. The war was over. Yet the cruelty had not ended. In some ways, it was becoming worse. Among the thousands of survivors gathered after the fall of Troy, one child inspired more fear than entire armies. He was not a warrior. He had never fought a battle. He had never held a sword. Yet to the Greek victors, he represented a threat that could not be ignored. His name was Astyanax, the young son of Hector and Andromache, and in the eyes of the Greeks, he was the last surviving symbol of Troy's future. Ancient warfare was often merciless. Victories were not always secured by defeating enemies in the present. Sometimes they were secured by eliminating enemies who might rise in the future. Astyanax embodied that fear. His father had been Troy's greatest hero. His bloodline connected him directly to the royal house. If he survived, he could one day become a rallying figure for Trojan refugees scattered across the Mediterranean. He could become a king, a claimant, a symbol, a reason for another war. The Greeks had spent 10 years destroying Troy. They intended to make sure Troy never returned. For Andromache, the situation was unbearable. She had already lost her husband, lost her city, lost her freedom. Now she faced the possibility of losing her son. Ancient sources describe one of the most heartbreaking moments in all Trojan tradition. The victors decided the child could not be allowed to live. Not because of anything he had done, because of what he might someday become. The decision reflected the brutal logic of ancient warfare. Mercy created risk. Risk created future enemies. Future enemies created future wars. To modern audiences, such reasoning feels horrifying. To many ancient rulers, it appeared practical. And practicality often proved more powerful than compassion. The story of Astyanax survived for centuries precisely because it symbolized something larger than a single tragedy. It represented the complete destruction of Troy. A city can rebuild walls. A city can rebuild homes. A city can rebuild temples. But once its future generation disappears, recovery becomes nearly impossible. That is why ancient writers returned to this story again and again, because in that moment, Troy lost more than a prince. It lost hope. And among the women watching helplessly, no one felt that loss more deeply than Andromache. Yet even her suffering would soon be overshadowed, because another survivor still remained. A woman who had predicted Troy's destruction from the very beginning. A woman nobody believed. A woman whose fate would become one of the darkest chapters of all. Cassandra. Long before Troy burned, before the Greek ships entered the harbor, before the city gates were breached, one woman had already seen disaster coming. Her name was Cassandra, and according to ancient tradition, she carried a curse more cruel than death. She could see the future, but nobody would ever believe her. Throughout the years of war, Cassandra warned her people repeatedly. She foresaw destruction. She foresaw betrayal. She foresaw the catastrophe hidden inside the famous wooden horse. Again and again she spoke. Again and again she was ignored. Now, standing among the ruins of Troy, Cassandra watched every one of her prophecies come true. The city was gone. The royal family was shattered. The survivors were prisoners. Everything she had warned about had happened. Yet her suffering was far from over, because victory celebrations had already begun among the Greeks. And among the victorious commanders stood one man who viewed Cassandra not as a princess, but as a prize. Ancient sources describe Cassandra being claimed by Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek coalition. For many observers, this may have appeared to be a fortunate outcome compared to the fate suffered by other captives. It was not, because Cassandra's visions did not end with Troy. She saw another tragedy waiting ahead, a tragedy in Greece, a tragedy involving Agamemnon himself. According to legend, Cassandra foresaw betrayal, murder, and bloodshed awaiting them after their return home. She warned him, just as she had warned the Trojans, and just as before. Nobody listened. There is something profoundly tragic about Cassandra's story. She survived every danger she predicted, only to remain powerless to stop it. Knowledge became a burden, not a gift. Each correct prophecy only deepened her isolation. Each fulfilled warning reminded her that truth alone changes nothing. The world does not always reward those who are right. Sometimes it punishes them, and Cassandra became one of history's most enduring symbols of that reality. For centuries, poets, playwrights, and historians returned to her story, not because she represented Troy's military defeat, but because she represented something universal, the pain of seeing disaster coming and being unable to prevent it. Yet while Cassandra's tragedy became legendary, another woman from Troy would carry an entirely different burden, a burden that had started the war itself. Her name was Helen, and after 10 years of bloodshed, everyone wanted to know what would happen to her. Of all the survivors who emerged from the ruins of Troy, none was more famous than Helen of Troy. For 10 years, kings had fought because of her. Heroes had died because of her. Cities had burned because of her. Or so the stories claimed. To generations of later writers, Helen became the face of the Trojan War itself. Yet when Troy finally fell, her story did not end. It entered a far more complicated chapter. The Greeks had come to Troy to reclaim her. Now they had succeeded. But success raised an uncomfortable question. What should happen next? The woman whose beauty supposedly launched 1,000 ships stood before the victors. The war had consumed countless lives. Could anyone truly return to normal? Ancient traditions offer different answers. Some portray Helen returning to Greece with Menelaus. Others emphasize reconciliation. Still others focus on lingering resentment and suspicion. The details vary. What remains consistent is the sense that no ending could fully erase what had happened, because victory does not automatically heal loss. For the surviving women of Troy, that truth became painfully clear. Andromache would live the rest of her life far from the city she loved. Hecuba would never again see the kingdom she once ruled. Cassandra's warnings would remain forever ignored. Countless unnamed women disappeared into slavery, exile, or forced relocation. The Trojan War ended. Their suffering continued. That is why the women of Troy remain such powerful figures in history and mythology. They remind us that wars are often remembered through generals, kings, and battles. But wars are lived through families, through widows, through mothers, through daughters, through survivors. The heroes of Troy earned immortal fame. The women of Troy inherited the consequences. And perhaps that is the real tragedy hidden behind one of history's most famous wars. Not how Troy fell, but what happened to those who survived it. Because for the women who watched the city burn, survival was not the happy ending. It was the beginning of a different kind of suffering.